Our keynote speaker, Dr. Heiner Lieth, is a professor and an extension specialist at UC Davis. He holds that joint appointment, and he obtained his PhD from North Carolina State University, focusing on crop modeling. In 1984, he became professor at the University UC Davis and focusing on greenhouse and nursery crop production. Initially, his research focused on ornamental plants, but since then, his program broadened to include protected cultivation of any horticulture plant and systems without field soil, leading to his co-edited and co-writing a book entitled Soilless Culture. Current and recent research areas include lighting technology, indoor plant production without sunlight, and photovoltaic energy production as part of plant production. He teaches undergraduate courses in greenhouse and nursery production, as well as a very popular course on the power of flowers. I would like to take that course. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Lieth. Here's your pointer. Thank you.
Yeah, hi, I'm Heiner Lieth. I'm a professor at UC Davis, and I've been there for a long time. And I've been here many times because I'm also an extension specialist, and I serve the floriculture nursery industry. So I've made many trips to San Diego, even to the point of speaking in Milano's packing shed and various other places. So this venue is spectacular compared to what I've had to put up with over the years. Imagine putting up a PowerPoint in a packing shed, you know. Well, we try. So anyway, I know the situation in San Diego reasonably well. I know that many greenhouse operators do not have fancy greenhouses. Many wish they had fancy greenhouses because that would be a nice investment, but you might not make your money back on a fancy greenhouse. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we mean by greenhouse, you know, and then over the years, there have been many times when I've suggested to San Diego flower growers that maybe they ought to put up some lamps. And because the rest of the world with greenhouses is putting lamps over their plants and getting their money back on that investment. But it was hard convincing San Diego flower growers, particularly with the type of lamp systems that were out. Well, the world has changed. It has shifted dramatically in the last 10 years. So the technologies have changed dramatically. So today I'm going to talk about various types of protected cultivation, controlled environments, and I'm also going to talk about agrivoltaics, and that is a domain where basically there's a use of sunlight for both plant production as well as making electricity. I'm trying to find a happy medium that works. And I'm not going to spill the beans right now, but I'm going to cover that. And we've been doing a substantial amount of research in that area. So I think I have some interesting things to present to you. So the first thing I'm going to do is talk about controlled environment agriculture, and particularly in relation to protected cultivation. From sort of a general perspective, the general population doesn't really know what a greenhouse is. Anything that's transparent might be considered controlled environment agriculture. But the way the terminology is being used right now, particularly in the sciences and the agricultural sciences, is that controlled environment agriculture is about controlling everything. And protected cultivation is about protecting your plants from bad stuff. And so I'm going to talk about that and then talk about some of the other things as I go along. So protected cultivation is that part where we really try to protect the plants from pests, from rain. I mean, you might want to think, well, why would you protect a plant from rain? Well, if you're a farmer, you know that there are times when you don't want rain and you need to keep it off your plants. And of course, if you don't have a structure for doing that, then you're not going to be doing that. So you're going to suffer whatever consequences that generates. So generally protected cultivation, we have all the same kinds of structures, greenhouses, growth chambers, indoor production, that could all be called protected cultivation. But those elements where we really control all the variables would not be considered protected cultivation. So controlled environment agriculture goes beyond protection. It goes towards optimizing. And when we're talking about optimizing, we're actually talking about taking full control. We're going to have higher input costs. Indeed, we're going to have higher input costs, but we are going to have a return on that investment. So the key is not to minimize your input costs. The key is to maximize your return on investment. And that's what all this is about. And so energy management is one of those things that's between the two areas is very different. Protected cultivation, you use what nature gives you and you try to deal with that and take advantage of that. Protected cultivation, controlled environment agriculture, you're going to invest. You're going to invest energy and other resources to get what you need about as perfectly as you can get it. So let's talk about the variables that we want to control. Temperature, surely, and there we're talking about air temperature, the root zone temperature, and actually also the tissue temperature. So the plant, we're talking about plants here. I hope that's clear. I'm talking about plants. So the plant tissues, leaves, stems, all that, we want to have the temperature be a certain way. And we know that for whatever you're trying to achieve, whatever your objective is for products that you're growing, that you're going to be selling, there is going to be an optimum temperature. And if you can't get it, well, you have to suffer with it. Relative humidity control is a big problem for almost anybody that tries to actually control it rather than just accept what is there. Carbon dioxide we can control, and invariably we will have some sort of method for injecting carbon dioxide, either purchase carbon dioxide in a tank, or we will burn natural gas, specifically clean natural gas, to create carbon dioxide. Nutrients and water, we also are able to optimize that. And there, in specific, we are going to be using methodologies where we contain the roots so that we can subject the roots to whatever we want. We're not going to have them in the ground, because in the ground, we are subject to whatever the soil is that's there. And while I respect that every farmer loves their soil and takes good care of their soil, or at least should, my perspective is soil is not ever going to be the optimum for the plants. For whatever plant you're growing, there's something other than soil that would make a more optimal growing environment. And in controlled environment, as well as protected cultivation, that is what we do. That's why nowadays, when you see plants growing in nurseries, you will see them in a container. And this is not a new invention. This was actually invented in the 1950s. Actually, it was a UC invention at Berkeley, which is before UC Davis existed. And so it is part of the science that you have at your disposal, is that my predecessors within the university figured out how to grow plants in soilless culture. On top of that, we can actually go a whole nother step further. We can go with liquid hydroponics, where we have no substrate. And it's all possible. In fact, we can even spray the roots with nutrient solution continuously, which we would call aeroponics. And that is the very fastest way to accumulate biomass on a plant. You optimize all the variables and you do that, and you will be amazed at how plants grow under those conditions. There's also a downside of it. If you don't have full control, if you make a mistake, whatever, the mistake is going to be a very expensive mistake, because aeroponics is very sensitive to needing everything exactly right. If the power fails, it's not going to work. So the types of structures that I deal with are greenhouses, and basically, I'm going to move a little faster here. We also have tunnels and cold frames, and I think much of what the general public sees as greenhouses actually is really just cold frames or tunnels. We have those. They are a type of protected cultivation. Shade houses, screen houses, these are all technologies that are out there that are part of protected cultivation. But in all those environments, we don't really have good control. We basically have an advantage to using those, but to get to actual full control, we actually need to use greenhouses or indoor production setups. Now, in greenhouses generally provide us with some structure that we can also mount tools. So most commonly what you will see in a greenhouse is you will see lamps mounted and you will see fans mounted. The fans are mounted so that you move air for whatever purpose you're going to move them, and the lamps are there to make light for times when the plants would otherwise not have enough light. And then when we talk about indoor production, we hear this now a lot on the news and in whatever channels you're looking at. When we're talking about indoor production, we're not talking about a greenhouse. We're talking about controlled environments in a room like this, where you actually are going to make all the light that the plant needs. Now, 10 years ago, that was going to only be feasible for plant production where the product generates a very high return on investment, if you know what I'm talking about. But we've now crossed over into the domain where this will actually work for a number of other plants also, especially if you can get good money for the advantage that it generates in the marketplace. And there, if you look at hydroponic lettuce, if you look at hydroponic basil, you go to the produce aisle and you see what's available there, you're going to find that you can make money there even without using sunlight. And I'll explain why that is even remotely possible today. Because if you just have the old paradigm in your head, you would think, well, you're going to use sunlight to make electricity, which is not efficient. And then you're going to use that electricity to make light, which is not that efficient. How are you going to come out ahead? Well, I'll explain that in a minute. So the kind of structures that we see as indoor production, they could be converted warehouses, and you will see they are around. They're even here in San Diego. They're everywhere. There are converted shipping containers that are designed to work for this kind of a thing. And there are purpose-built structures where people essentially start with a piece of land and build a structure on top of it. So with indoor plant production, we are going to be using the various things like growth chambers, growth rooms, and in particularly the light is the photosynthetic active radiation is made with lamps instead of from sunlight. And it's all possible because we have new technologies in lighting, we have new technologies on the soilless culture side, such as hydroponics, and we also have new tools coming along in terms of air handling. So there we can actually enrich the carbon dioxide to a level that would be very difficult to do in a greenhouse. And we have humidity control. And for the holy grail of it all, we can actually capture the water back out of the air, which is the humidity, and we can use that water for our plants. So when you get to that particular point, it's important to understand it's a complete game changer compared to conventional agriculture, because we can grow plants with just a limited amount of water, and we can just reuse that water again and again. We pull it back out of the air and we grow plants that way. And the water use efficiency that you get that way is unbeatable. You cannot reach it with greenhouse production, and you cannot reach it with field production. So if you go into places where they have a serious drought, we have a really serious drought. This is going to be important, okay? And while we all hope it will never get that bad, we can. It's important for us to be working in ways that expose whether we can do it, okay? And that is a domain that I've been working on, is to try to optimize and figure out. We can also stack things, So in a room like this, we would not be satisfied with simply one layer of plant production as you would have in a field or in a greenhouse. Here we would stack. And this picture you see, there's a stack of 6 layers. Here, actually, the lights are off to take the photograph, but here there are more layers, 2, 4, 6, 7 layers. This is a company called AeroFarms in New Jersey and spreading across the continent. And these companies are coming online and they're using warehouse space fairly efficiently, and many more are coming into place. So all of this is because we have lighting systems that can do things for us today that we couldn't do in the past. And there I'm going to distinguish between HID lamps, which is high intensity discharge lamps, and LED lamps, which is light emitting diode technology. So the HID lamps are lamp systems where you have some glowing filament and it's generating a lot of heat and it's generating a lot of light. And we have very good lamps out there. And the most commonly used HID lamp out there is the high pressure sodium lamp. And I would say just about every cannabis grower has a corner on the market on those, okay? And they're used extensively. They're also used in greenhouse production, and particularly in northern climates where you have many times during the year where the weather is so bad that the light is just, your plants aren't growing. So in order to have that production be adequate, you have to come in and supply some additional photosynthetic active radiation. That's, you know, and you have to generate that with the lamps. Either of these two systems will create photosynthetic active radiation, depending on what the technology is designed for that you have. I do have here a question that is, I'm always prompting this, and that's because whenever I give talks, people talk to me about, well, why wouldn't we just use the sunlight? Because the sunlight is free, right? Well, it's not free. If you're in a greenhouse, sunlight is not free. You got fans that are pushing the heat out, and those fans need electricity. And so to be able to have that, you're going to be spending money on the cooling. All right. And then so basically sunlight generally is not free. If you're doing the math, you got to figure out how free it is, or how cheap it is, or how it's going to cost you. And so anyway, let's talk a little bit about some details with respect to light. And in a greenhouse, generally it's fairly easy to reduce light. It's very easy to take it away. And in fact, it always baffles me as I go and visit greenhouses. There's so much happening in terms of taking it away that it's kind of weird to me. Like right now, greenhouses have whitewash on them already. Okay, well, whitewash is a way of reducing the amount of solar radiation going into the greenhouse. It reduces the photosynthetic active radiation. It also reduces the heat load. And of course, it's done because you got to keep the heat under control. But already now in May, we have this in place. Whereas, you know, it's not even hot yet. It's a little hot here today, but it's not really what we're going to have in August and September. So making light is then very difficult, relatively speaking, and you have to pay for that. You have to pay for the electricity. So the light, the reason we have the light, we use it to drive photosynthesis, but we also use it to drive photoperiodic control. So if you have a photoperiodic plant, it's going to potentially need a short night or a short day or something, and that is a matter of controlling the light with blackout curtains and with some kind of lighting system. And the other thing is that the other parts of this that's important for the plant is stomatal function. So the stomata on the leaves are where water emits from the leaves. So carbon dioxide goes in, water vapor comes out. And this water vapor is the water you bought and put on the plants so the plants wouldn't wilt. And it's also the transport system for moving fertilizer nutrients inside the plant up into the top part of the plant. So these things are all intertwined. If you simply switch one of them on or off, you got to pay attention that all of these are in some ways controlled. In fact, there may well be other things that light affects also, and I'm not going to go into speculative details here now. So let me talk a little bit about how the light emitting diodes come along and how lamps make light. PAR stands for photosynthetic active radiation. It's kind of common term in all the lamp world. People talk about PAR light, and it means photosynthetic active radiation. In the spectrum, that is the exact same set of wavelengths as what we call shortwave radiation, which we as humans know as visible light. So if you see a light source and it's below 400 nanometers, you do not see that it's there. Your eyes can't pick it up. You can get a nice sunburn from it, but you can't see it. Okay. On the upper end of the spectrum at 700 nanometers, you're getting into the red and the far red. Again, in the far red, you basically cannot really see it. You might be able to detect a little hint of red, but for the most part, our eyes won't deal with it. The plants are surprisingly in exactly the same spectrum. So I want to show you some examples of the thinking that we have about this. And I'm always curious because I've talked with my colleagues, some of whom are plant physiologists, about this, and I have a hard time getting a straight answer as exactly what is going on. So you can, of course, use that power tool that we all have, Google, and search online for images of spectra. And you will search for two different types of spectra. One is called the chlorophyll absorption spectrum, and the other one is called the photosynthetic action spectrum. So the chlorophyll absorption spectrum is essentially what a leaf absorbs. Okay, and what you see in this curve here has got two massive peaks in it. Well, most of the absorption is in the 400 to 500 nanometers, and then from 600 to 700 nanometers, or 600 to 700 nanometers. So there's a lot of absorption there. In between there's not that much, according to this diagram. The photosynthetic action spectrum is a little different. And in fact, when you go online and you look for these graphs, you'll find they all look different. None of them are exactly the same, and I get the impression that they are made by an artist. So what do you think the LED lamp engineers looked at when they created LED lamps for growers? I'm afraid they looked at this and they thought this was science, and nobody told them that this was art. So I implore you to be very careful when you buy a lamp these days, that you actually look at the spectrum, okay, and see what the spectrum is. So as a point of reference, I'm going to give you a bunch of these white panels that are all graphs that show the light on the vertical axis as energy units, irradiance in microwatts per square centimeter, per millimeter, per nanometer of wavelength. And the red box in here, this is basically the photosynthetically active part of the spectrum. It goes from 400 to 700. And your eyes will see blue and red, and of course some colors in between. And then infrared light and ultraviolet light. And as you can see, there's a considerable amount of the spectrum that the sun provides. Granted, this is through a cloud layer, but it's pretty much what the sun does. And you'll see that, okay, there's a lot of energy that's there, but there's also a lot of energy that's not PAR. This is part of what I'm saying is the sunlight isn't actually completely free, because you get a whole bunch of sunlight that the plants can't use. And this sunlight also has to be gotten rid of as heat, right? Because it generates heat. So photosynthetic active radiation, we have known for many years, when you look at the rate of leaf photosynthesis, I'm sorry, it says net leaf photosynthesis, but it's actually gross leaf photosynthesis. It's a saturated curve and it levels out. And to give you a sense as to what the units are on the horizontal axis, 1200 micromoles is actually about as much light as you have outside right now. Okay, maybe a little less. So if you actually get more light than 1200 micromoles, the curve doesn't go much higher. It's fairly level. And in fact, this is an important thing to look at is, you know, between 600 nanometers, between 600 micromoles per meter squared per second and 1200, there's really not that much benefit to additional light. So this is not where you would add lamps. This is where, if anything, you might say, oh, we could get away with doing a little shading, which I will talk about later. But But if you look at it from the part between 0 and 200 nanometer, micromoles per meter squared, you can see it's almost linear in here, so that every percent of additional radiation that you provide actually will significantly increase the photosynthetic rate. Now, when do we have that condition? We have it every morning. We have it every afternoon, late in the afternoon. We have it every time there's a heavy overcast sky. So under those conditions, there's room for improvement. If your greenhouse isn't particularly clean, if you got crud, that's a technical term, if you got crud on the outside that could be washed off, then you are probably in this zone where I'm pointing right now, probably 200 to 400, even in the middle of the day. And that is a loss. Unless you need it to control the temperature, which may well be the case if you don't have high quality structures. So the conventional wisdom is that photosynthetic active radiation is really everything between 400 and 700 nanometers. And prior to the advent of LED lamps, in the sciences, we treated all those wavelengths as being the same, despite the fact that the artists have already figured out that it's not. Okay. Trying to get some of my colleagues to maybe become artists also, and maybe I should pick up the baton there. Anyway, let me talk about lamps. Okay, so the lamps that are in this room, these are, of course, I shouldn't say of course, they are fluorescent lamps. They flicker a little bit, and if they were white LED lamps, they would not flicker. Okay, but that's the fundamental difference. You can get these now as all LED lamps. And if you take all these fluorescent lamps out and put LED lamps in their place, you will reduce your energy use in half. They're that much more efficient for energy production. These lamps that I'm showing pictures of here, the incandescent bulb and that abomination CFL, somebody needs to get the pantsuit off for that piece of garbage. But I'm sorry. Don't use compact fluorescents. They don't have a longer life. It's almost like whatever they claim they don't do. But anyway, we're not using those, okay? And we're not going to use fluorescent tubes either to grow plants. We're going to use other technologies. So with HID lamps, let's look at a few. This one is low pressure sodium. We don't use low pressure sodium except in this particular greenhouse. You can see it's in greenhouse. These were reclaimed from a drug bust. And it goes to the point that cannabis growers back when they were getting busted knew nothing about plant growth lighting. Because if you know anything about plant growth lighting, you know that this is a terrible lamp. I mean, look at the energy. You're making more energy that's not useful than you're making that's useful. Okay. It's got this massive spike in where you can't even see it. Okay. But on top of that, you know, the light peak in there is like around 600 there instead of around 650, and there's almost no light in the blue part of the spectrum. So this lamp is crap. Okay, just simple. I know we don't have lighting salespeople here, but I stand by my. Metal halide lamp is actually a pretty good lamp. And if you look at the spectrum here, you can see that it has a lot of blue, which plants can use. It doesn't have much red. It has some. I mean, note that the entire area under this curve is here, so it has all the wavelengths. But anyway, it could certainly have more red. And if I was going to pair this lamp with another lamp of some sort, I would pair it with something that has a lot of red in it, maybe even these. This is a lamp. The company is Lumigro. I'm not sure they're still around, but they were selling lamps, and they had this innovation where you could dial and adjust the blue up and down. You could adjust the red up and down, which was testament to the fact that they didn't know what the spectrum needed to be. And they also couldn't find a grower to tell them. So they gave the buttons, the knobs, so a grower could basically decide what they want and adjust. You know, And this was their way to escape criticism. And so I just bring this back, this artist's rendering, and you can see that, yeah, things line up pretty good. Okay. And now if we could only get the blue up as high as that, of course. No, never mind. This is an artist's rendering, okay? See how you fall into the trap of looking at a beautiful color image and think, oh yeah, that must be right. No. Anyway, here's another lamp, similarly situated, although here, yeah, anyway. So the key here is that because we can do this, we can make these kinds of lamp systems now, we avoid all that energy that is not necessary by the plants. So we make PAR that is primarily the wavelengths that we know are driving photosynthesis. And one of those bands is between 400 and 500, and the other one is between 600 and 700. And the common wisdom is that between 500 and 600 is not useful at all. So why put that into the lamp to begin with? We actually did a research project. I'm not going to report on it here, but we found that actually the green light does help the plant, and leaving it out is not a good idea. So there's actually some advantage to having the full spectrum, but to have within the full spectrum a bit more blue and a bit more red. That's kind of the best light that I could think of today. And the lamps that I'm having built for me basically are structured that way. This is an induction lamp, which to my surprise is amazing, except for that massive peak right in the middle, which is right where the green is, but I know the plants don't need that much green. By the way, if anybody ever asks you, what the plants look like when you have them under blue and red light, they look black. They look black because the plants are actually consuming all the blue and the red, and the reflection that comes off it is in the green, and you're not making green light, and the plants are not generating green photons. So when you're looking at a plant that's growing under red and blue LEDs, it looks black. The minute you take it out and pull the sunlight, you see it's a perfectly good plant, all the green you could ever want. Anyway, let me check my time. Yeah, I know I'm not in trouble yet with you, but I'm going to be shortly. Oh, look at that, 13:45. Oh yeah, I'm going to have to pick up some speed here. So I'm going to talk now about agrivoltaics. And this actually is a domain that goes to energy management, because as I've already shown you, using electricity is a relatively big deal in this world if you have it. If you have to buy it, it's going to cost you money. And right now, when you're buying electricity, you're paying, how many of you know what you're paying kilowatt hour price? I know one of you knows. So what's the going rate in San Diego?
It varies because we're on a sliding scale. From, super off peak to on peak.
Okay. So what's off peak?
35 cents.
35 cents. Okay. Now, I'm going to just blast ahead a little bit. When you're using PV, photovoltaics, to make your own electricity, and you figure all the costs of doing it, it used to be a price similar to that before the price of PV came down like crazy. The price of PV today is at a place where when you make your own electricity, it is much less than 35 cents per kilowatt hour, which means that you would do well to put as much solar on your property as San Diego Power and Light is willing to take from you, or Cal Addison is willing to take from you, okay, and give you money for it. But when I look at buying photovoltaics right now and attaching it to an indoor facility, and not even attaching it to the grid, but using all the power, I'm figuring it's going to be somewhere around 5 to 10 cents per kilowatt hour. That will be my cost. At that price, you can make money growing vegetables in containers. And that's the secret sauce. It's today. Okay. You have to pay the utilities rate to make electricity, to use their electricity, it's going to be tough. You can sell cannabis. But if you are going to make your own electricity and you can consume your own electricity, and the price of that is relatively low, you will be able to make money in indoor production. So anyway, but I did want to talk about something that goes to making your electricity. And that is, at the same time that you're doing agriculture, you're also creating electricity. And for that, typically we have the typical kind of PV panels that you have seen. You see them on all the roofs, or not all the roofs, but many roofs. And you will also see them on tracking systems, like this image down here at the bottom. Basically, the panels are attached and they are always facing the sun. Now, the world I'm going to expose you to is one where don't look so much at the panel, but look at the shadow on the ground. So the shadow on the ground is, of course, the shadow cast by the solar panel. Now, see all that land where there's no shade? Well, that's lit at this particular moment, and you can grow plants there. Now, later on in the afternoon, well, I don't remember now if this was morning, afternoon, but the opposite end of the day, that shadow is in a different place. And of course, you have a moving shadow that moves. So then the question is, well, what can you grow in partial shade or in partial shade where the shade moves? You know, what is possible? So I did a project about a dozen years ago where we used tubular photovoltaic technology. There's a company called Cylinder, which no longer exists. But this technology actually is coming back. There are a number of companies that are now coming back to the market with a product like this. And the idea here is that you basically have a tubular thing that doesn't have to actually move. You place it. These images here show it on a rooftop with a white reflective surface underneath. And basically the idea, when I saw this, I thought, well, you know, you could put plants underneath there and then grow plants in the shade of that set of photovoltaics. But, sorry, I need to move fast, otherwise I'm getting in trouble. So we built a facility at UC Davis, which I still have, where we essentially tried to use these tubes. And we realized right off the bat that if the shade system was the standard rooftop system, then it would be taking too much light away from plants. And so the only way I agreed to work with the company on this was if they would make me some new panels that were half the density. So S88 refers to this spacing between the tubes, and their conventional technology is S44, which there would be a tube where I'm pointing right now. But for this project, those were taken out. So we have a section that is the lighter shade, section that is the deeper shade. And then we also had a shade cloth section where the shade cloth section was roughly the same as the S88. And this is the shade house. This is what it looks like. And again, don't look above. I know your eyes are drawn to the plants, but look at the shadow on the ground, because that's what the plants are experiencing. And you can see that this is the S44. There's, it's fairly dark there, relatively speaking. But obviously, I mean, you can see from the way you can actually see that there's still plenty of light. And many plants actually do something reasonable with that. The S88 looks like this, and you can actually see that there's stripes, right? Stripes of shadow on the ground. And as the sun moves across the sky, those move. And then this was the shade cloth. And all right, I'm going to skip. I got to skip. I only have 5 minutes remaining, right? Anyway, we found that, well, we grew a whole ton of different nursery crops. This was all designed as a nursery project, and we wanted to see how our shade house would work with this technology on it. It worked great, okay? For some things, in fact, I know you can't really see anything on these pictures. I'm going to go fast forward through them, but we had them and they all grew to some extent. But in general, the plants that had the most shade grew the worst, so to speak. But it was still all acceptable. And so the darkest treatment had lesser growth. And so then we also grew some leafy greens, grew some herbs. Here's basil. I can't see any difference. Lettuce actually likes a little bit of shade in Davis because it's hot in the summer. Kale, again, kale does a little bit better if it's a little cooler. And so we actually had sort of a mixed bag of responses, but on the whole, it did work fairly well. But it does beg the question, and it did beg the question for us because Cylinder went out of business and we couldn't get these tubes anymore. What about using conventional panels? And so we did a project together with SunPower at their research facility in Davis, where we had panels on trackers. And so we're growing plants under the various types of systems. And the whole question here was, can we grow agricultural crops between the rows of trackers of solar panels? So the answer is yes. The answer is, for everything that we tried, you could, okay? There were some losses, the more shade, and you can see actually here in this image, you can see directly under a panel, you know, and this is close to midday, so the shadow is right there. But the plants that are right in the middle of the tracker, they generally don't do very well. In fact, what I'm going to do is, I'm going to skip all this scientific mumbo jumbo and go straight to the oops. Yeah. So this is kind of the essence of it. The plants, well, one thing I need to say about trackers today. A decade ago, when people were installing trackers for the purpose of electricity production, to maximize electricity production, the trackers were very close together and there was very little space in between. In fact, if they were level, you could just barely get in between them, okay? And they moved them as close together as possible. And the solar PV companies have realized that the further they spread them apart, the higher your return on investment is. So if you have the land, they already nowadays will push your trackers further apart. When you install them, they will say, put them further apart. And this is actually a perfect example of this because SunPower is in the business of selling trackers in addition to solar panels. And this is what they are promoting as the way to install trackers nowadays. So you have actually quite a bit of space in between. Now, you might say, okay, well, that's full sun. It's full sun sometimes, but everything in there is full sun sometimes. The problem is it's shaded at some point also. But the further you put the trackers apart, the more land you have that is open, as you see here. And what we basically saw that if you're going to do this, and let's say you're a small farm and you'd like to make some extra income and you want to install solar panels because you know that you're going to make money with that, selling it to people who are going to resell it at 35 cents per kilowatt hour. So you're going to be, you're going to have some open space that looks open. And the plants that we tested, we find that in the shade, sort of near the middle of the tracker, underneath the trackers where it's very shady, right in the middle there is not much good for anything, okay? It's also not good to walk there because you bang your head on the infrastructure. But a little further out, you know, when you're still sort of under, when the panel's flat, you're under that, you can grow leafy greens there without too much trouble. And if you're going to grow tomatoes and peppers, you better put them in the middle that see a lot of heavy duty sunlight. If you're growing broccoli, it also needs to be in the middle. It actually grows better in shade when it's vegetative, but when you're putting the head on, the head of broccoli, you need full sun, or as close to full as you can get. So if you're a small farm, even if were organic, you could potentially have this sitting there. So the main thing is that this is a way of making electricity. It's a way of making electricity on the same land where you're also growing plants. And There's more research being done on this now because the real question is no longer whether it works. The question is, what's the percent of space, or how's the space utilization going to be? If you listen to the PV sellers, they want you to maximize the amount of PV that you buy. It's obvious, right? They're trying to make their buck. You just need to be careful not to buy too much, okay? Because you need to find that balance. And anyway, so I promised I was going to leave some time for questions, and I'll open the floor to questions. Yeah.
Why did SunPower advise putting the trackers further apart for efficiency?
So the thing is that when they're sitting like this, which way is east? East is that way, right? So when they're sitting, and in the morning, they're all going to be as steep set as possible to catch the sunlight as it comes across.
Oh, they want them shading each other.
So then they're shading each other. Yeah. And the further they are apart, the sooner that stops. So it's not a huge amount. And it kind of is, it's kind of a problem for growers. I know, because I've been around growers for 35 years, and I've been at many parties with growers, and the mantra is greed is good. But not in this case. In this case, you're better off not being quite so greedy and having it further apart. And in fact, it also helps if you're going to grow plants, because then you're actually going to have more space where plants can thrive. Okay?
Okay.
I don't think that there's another reason, but that is the main one. I would also say that actually a lot of people in the PV industry are now advising to not install trackers at all, because it's hard to get your money back when the total investment has dropped so dramatically, and the trackers are so expensive. Yeah.
It is good to note that the artificial lighting systems can be as effective as the natural radiation in terms of photosynthesis and so on. But if there, has been any abuse of overlong, exposure to radiation from artificial, has there been any, issues with unbalanced photosynthesis and photorespiration or respiration that disrupts, crop productivity?
Not that I know of. My sense is that if you are able to make light, it can be done in such a way that it always benefits. In fact, for the most part, for many things that I'm growing, I have light 24 hours a day. And there's a general thought, oh, plants need some rest time. They do not. They don't need any rest. There are some plants where if you give them 24 hours of light a day and you don't give them any dark period in there, there's certain things they won't do. Certainly photoperiodic plants won't do what they're supposed to do if you don't give them the right photoperiod. But roses, I know rose growers have always been very interested in supplemental lighting. And there, what many growers observed was that if you give them 24 hours of light, you will have excellent productivity, but the biomass will be brittle, okay, which is going to be a problem in post-harvest handling. So a lot of growers tried going all the way to 24 hours a day, but then actually cut that back and have maybe 2 hours of dark, 4 hours of dark at night.
Is there any new initiative or new project that is follow the cylinders? And,
Yes. So there's a new company that's just trying to get on the market, and they had the company is called Taka Solar, and they're coming along with a tubular technology. There's also a company in Europe. I'm not going to mention their name because I think it's Vapor. That's not the name of the company. I think they are. I haven't seen any product despite 5 years of them saying they're going to come with it. And I would expect more to come. There's also some really interesting stuff on the horizon. I was speaking yesterday with a company called Clearview out of Australia that's actually taking panels of glass and putting a material in between two layers of glass that fluoresces, and then they put the PV on the edges so that the fluorescence goes to the sides, and they make electricity. And when you're looking through the window, it looks like a clear window. And obviously, if it's actually clear, that would be really, really interesting for those of us that want to grow plants. And so far, I haven't seen any data, but and that is not the only company that's doing something like that. There's another company that's aiming for that. So it's actually very surprising that these new technologies are coming along. There is actually an outfit out of Santa Cruz that was actually partnered by a professor at UC Santa Cruz, and they have this kind of fluorescent material, and their I think it's a plastic material. It looks pink when you see it. So it's like a pink fluorescent material. And so they have strips that make electricity embedded in that. And they claim to come out ahead. When I tested it, I couldn't come out ahead. But people are trying, new things are coming along. And if you run across something and you want to test it, let me know. We can do tests. And I'm always skeptical. So